Okay, do you have the first slide by any chance? There you
Okay,
go.
so we're going to get started, and we have one of the PIPA participants that's going to introduce you, Dr. Sisson. So Jess,
Okay.
would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hello, I'm Jess, and it's nice to meet you today. So I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Graham Sisson today. He was appointed to the United States Military Academy, which was West Point, so go Army, in 1982, and was scheduled to report to cadet basic training, but was injured on June 27th of 1982 in a head-on motor vehicle collision with a drunk driver, which left Dr. Sisson with a closed head injury and permanent paralysis from the waist down and a full-time wheelchair user. In January of 1983, Dr. Sisson entered the University of North Alabama. He graduated summa cum laude in 1987 with a Bachelor's of Science in Accounting and a minor in English and History. He received the Keller Key for the highest GPA and the Tourist Fidelis highest reward for graduating senior upon his graduation. In his senior year, he was elected SGA president. And while at UNA, Dr. Sisson was inducted into the Omicron Delta Kappa Leadership Honorary and the Sigma Tau Delta English Honorary. He is also a member of Alpha Theta Omega fraternity. After his graduation from UNA, Dr. Sisson attended Vanderbilt Law School and graduated in 1990 with a JD and is licensed since September of 1990. Prior to being appointed a Deputy Attorney General and Assistant Attorney General with the state of Alabama, Dr. Sisson has worked for several Birmingham law firms. He now serves as the state's ADA coordinator and Assistant Attorney General with the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services. He was appointed by Governor Kay Ivey as the Director of the Governor's Office on Disability and State ADA Coordinator. Dr. Sisson serves as an adjunct law professor, teaching disability law courses at Birmingham School of Law, and taught a doctoral course in disability law and history at Auburn University. Dr. Sisson received his doctorate in rehabilitation from Auburn University in 2016. Dr. Sisson's hobbies are vegetable gardening and woodworking. He is also a certified scuba diver. He is a graduate of the 2005 Leadership Birmingham class and Leadership Alabama of 2017. He is also a 2019 graduate of the FBI Citizens Academy. So thank you, and we are looking forward to hearing from you today.
Fine introduction. Thank you very much. Some of my information was already, a lot of the panel did an excellent job. I'm going to try to summarize some of my slides. I'm not going to read my slides verbatim today, but I'm going to give you my own personal experience in employment. I'm also going to talk about the law. I'm going to make the law interesting though, because it is, to me, it's interesting. But what happens, you heard today about trying to match people with disabilities to the job. Sometimes somebody with a disability meets all the qualifications, but there's stigma and stereotypes about that person with a disability. And that results in that person not getting a job. What is that person going to do then? I'm going to talk about some of those options. And of course, the first slide that you see gave some of the information that's already been shared by Jess. The next slide has my contact information. So if you can't reach me by phone or email, then I must be dead, okay? Or I'm in somewhere on the side of the road in a ditch, okay? I will get back to you, I promise. The next slide, I say it's in every presentation as an Assistant Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, all information provided is non-binding. It's accurate. It's not evidence in a court of law. And of course, this is the Ultra Reader's Digest version. This is your beginning journey into thinking about it. And one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, I want to say congratulations to everybody in the PIPA class of 2023. So I'm going to talk about employment statistics for people with disabilities in Alabama. You got a lot of statistics. I'm going to kind of reframe those a little bit in the context of what I'm talking about in relationship to employment. Then, of course, awareness of the rights and responsibility of the employer and employers with disabilities. If you're advocating as a person with a disability wanting a job, it's important to know what the law, how the law will help you. And again, I know one thing you can know about the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, it has not led to more people with disabilities being employed, but usually people who know their rights get what they're trying to accomplish. In other words, knowing your rights will help you get that job too. So, and of course, Jane Litz Birdshaw, or Commissioner Birdshaw at the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services, talked a little bit about vocational rehabilitation services. I'm going to break down exactly what VR is and what the vocational rehabilitation process is and what eligibility. So, and I'm going to get this done in less than an hour. I will dare say less than 45 minutes. So it's a lot of information, but hopefully you will be awake and you will be energized after my presentation. The panel before did an excellent job. It's a lot of information. That's a hard slot right after lunch. See, they got you energized up. I get that advantage. So, all right, the next slide, please. My personal experience, you heard that I was injured in a 1982 motor vehicle accident. I was only 17 years old. It was right after high school. You know, I was on my way to the United States Military Academy, or West Point, go Army. And this happened to me just like that. I was what you called a TAB, temporarily able-bodied. To get in West Point, you had to meet mental and physical requirements, very strict. And then I acquired a very significant disability. I attended both college and law school using a wheelchair, but I suffered some employment discrimination. So when I'm telling you about the law and about your rights, I know it firsthand, not just as a lawyer, but as an individual with a developmental disability myself. I went to many law firms. I sent out a bunch of resumes to a bunch of law firms. I got rejection letters from some law firms that I didn't even send a resume to. We call those stray bullets, okay? So one law firm I did interview with, I made it through all the partners in the law firm, and those are the people that make the hiring decision. I got to the managing partner, the grand poobah, got to him, and he goes, "Why do you want to work anyway? You can live off the government." And I'm thinking to myself, I've got over $60,000 in law school loans. You cannot live off the government if you never work. We know that Social Security supplemental income is now a little over $700, close to $800. So my law school loans repayments were over $1,000 a month, because back then it was over 9% interest. So anyway, I've experienced the public perception of people with disabilities. So not only do you have to have a qualifications as a person with a disability, you also have to overcome the public perception or the stereotypes and the myths that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. So I will give the example, the $5 example. I'm not giving you all the examples. The other, y'all just leave to your imagination. The $5 example, I'm all dressed up in downtown Birmingham. My law firm is one of those big high rises. I go to the elevator, I get on the street, I'm waiting on a street corner, because back then you couldn't file documents electronically. You had to go to the clerk and you had to go argue motions. And now because of COVID, you can argue those virtually. So I was waiting on a street corner. Somebody came up to me, and I was dressed in a suit and a tie. And I was all it was crisp shirt, white shirt, red tie, gray trousers, gray jacket. Somebody came up to me and they stuck a $5 bill in my pocket. You know, and the question is, first question comes to mind, what did I do? I kept it, of course, okay? But the idea, I was on a street corner, I must be begging. They didn't see that I was dressed in a suit and I had a legal file on my lap. So that's a perception thing that we still need to overcome. But I think being qualified, and I'm talking about that in terms of the law, what qualified is, but another thing that vocational rehab and all the other partners that were mentioned today can help people with disabilities and developmental disabilities is building confidence. So the next slide, make sure my time, okay? Employment statistics. And again, you're the statistic from the United Ability, 72% of people with disabilities are unemployed. I was using the figure of 70%. And again, this is too high. No other group in this country has that high of an unemployment rate. So the next slide, it's one of those that I'm not going to read this slide out, but again, you can see that employment went down. The unemployment of people with disabilities even went further in 2021 and in 2020. So the next slide, the 2022 employment statistics. And these statistics, I can barely say it this afternoon on Friday. The employment rate of persons with disabilities in Alabama is 29%. So what does that mean? That 71% of people with disabilities are unemployed. And again, so that was for persons without disabilities, the employment rate is 73%. See that difference? That's shocking. It's over 40%. So the next slide, annual wages. This also puts in perspective. The national median annual wage for all workers with disabilities is $23,684. For workers without disabilities, that's $32,691. So again, even if you get a job, making sure that you receive the same level of wages. And again, the Americans with Disabilities Act hopefully will cure this. The next slide on remote working. And Commissioner Jane Elizabeth Bertishaw alluded to this. This is the good news. COVID, because of the contagiousness of that disease, employers had to allow people to work from home. And that when you allowed people to work from home, that opened the door for many people with disabilities, because we know in survey after survey in Alabama, the number one unmet need is transportation. So COVID, remote working, it eliminates that barrier to employment called transportation. So being able to work remotely or from home has led to increased employment for people with disabilities. And generally, nationally, since COVID started, the employment of people with disabilities is up 25%. So the next slide. Perspective. My goal today in discussing employment with you is to outline legal and practical information. It's the practical side, because you may not remember the legal as much. I want you to remember especially the practical. And the practical means that you can apply the legal to a situation that might arise when you try to obtain employment. So I will also share my personal experience, which I have. I gave you the, living off the government example. That's a myth that's out there. So again, my first job, accounts receivable clerk, was accounts receivable clerk. And I got that job because of network. I was in a fraternity. I think we're a little bit ahead on the slides, but I was in a fraternity. And one of my fraternity brothers was an accountant at a big Books A Million. I got a job at Books A Million for summer before I went to law school. So my first law job was an associate attorney. So stuff rolls downhill when you're an associate, but you get a lot of good experience. So interviewing, there was a question about whether I could drive. They saw me in a wheelchair. There's no way that sucker can drive. He's paralyzed. So you know what I did? And this is a good tip for all the people watching this. I said, come on, let me show you my car. I opened up the door, showed them what hand controls with. I hopped into the car. I folded my wheelchair up. I threw it behind the back seat. Bam, like you're hired. So they want to make sure I could travel to all the courthouses around the state of Alabama. I started out in insurance defense. I tried cases in almost every courthouse, county courthouse in Alabama, and being able to drive helped me to do that. So the next slide, this is a picture of me when I was 25 years old. I look the same, right? Yeah, right. So again, I sent resumes again to a large number of firms. I told you about the stray bullet. I told you about the partner saying I could just live off the government. I clerked for 2 large law firms during the summer. Yeah, my grades were good enough in law school that I was hired, and that led to a lot of contacts. So again, employment is really truly the great equalizer in life. It often leads not only a good sound paycheck and an increased quality of life, but also it leads to making good contacts and to friends. And it's often how somebody is measured. When you meet a stranger on the street, a lot of times they'll say, what do you do? And you would like to be able to say, I'm fully employed and I work at this employer. So again, and I did not mention my disability on my resume ever. And they say, oh, you're using a wheelchair. But when they call me back for an interview, I would say, does your building have an elevator? They say, of course, we're in downtown Birmingham. All the buildings have elevators. So that was an easy one. So the next slide. There's a caveat here. The anti-discrimination employment provisions of the ADA have not led to greater employment for people with disabilities. I mentioned this before. The best tactic would appear to emphasize qualifications over rights. Don't say, hey, this is my right to the job. I'm demanding my rights. Never demand your rights, but then when they're not met, then follow up. So again, emphasize qualification over rights. Next slide. The disability specific laws. And the good news is, I'm not talking about every one of these laws and every aspect of these laws today. I'm giving you the Ultra Reader's Digest version. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, and the Rehabilitation Act 1973, Section 501. You say, why Section 501 and Section 504, right? You thought you were going to stump the legal here. Section 501, if you want to apply for a job with the federal government. And I can tell you, for people with disabilities, apply for the job for the federal government. They are actively recruiting people with disabilities. There's affirmative action requirements under Section 501, but there's no affirmative action requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So again, just some tidbits. I hope you're taking good notes because they're going to make me give you a test at the end. Okay. So please pay attention. So next slide, ADA overview. These are what I call the bullets. When you think about jobs, mainstreaming, being fully integrated in society, you know, that's one of the last frontiers for people with disabilities is reaching the American dream of getting a job. In equal opportunity, the ADA doesn't guarantee anybody a job. It guarantees you an equal opportunity. In other words, to get your foot in the door to get a job. And it's about access. There's wheelchair access. People think that I'm only going to talk about wheelchair access because you use a wheelchair. Wrong. I'm going to talk about also communications access. If you're blind or deaf, making sure there's effective communication. There are strong provisions in all parts of the ADA, especially in employment, that effective communication be provided in the interview process and during the job. So, and of course, the civil rights law. It's unfortunate that we need a law to preserve our civil rights, but that's a fact. People aren't just going to do the right thing necessarily because there's myths and stereotypes. And I think a lot of discrimination in employment occurs against people with disabilities because of ignorance. I don't think it's actual animosity or ill will towards people with disabilities. So the next slide, please, sir. These are the 5 parts or 5 titles of the ADA. I'm just going to talk about Title I, employment. So, and we added in some video games from the 1980s. You'll hear that every once in a while. That is definitely for your listening pleasure today. Okay. All right. Definition of disability. The next slide. Hey, I'm a man of my word. Okay. So here we go. The 3-part definition, somebody with a developmental disability is going to fall into each of these categories. And again, that first one, the mental or physical impairment, substantial limits, a major life activity. This is the one that people traditionally think as a disability. So the next slide, the rights and responsibilities. And again, there's a duty not to discriminate against qualified individuals with disabilities. And again, a qualified individual with disability is a person with a disability who can perform the essential job functions or major job task of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. So again, if you can't do the job, the Americans with Disabilities Act is not going to protect you. So it includes all terms, conditions of employment. That's application, that's benefits, that's hiring, salaries, everything. So, and again, it covers application and interview process, not just the job. So reasonable accommodation for the job and fringe benefits. Again, reasonable accommodation is the great equalizer. That is what enables people with significant disabilities to do jobs. My first reasonable accommodation, I've had many in my over 30 years of employment. My first job in the law firm was I couldn't get under the desk. So you know what they did? Do you think they bought me a new desk? No, they did not buy me a new desk. They took an old desk and they put a bunch of law books under the 4 legs and lifted it up. It didn't look very good, but it was effective. It worked. I made some money after a year and they bought me a new desk. Everybody wins. Everybody wins. So an employee with a disability has a duty to maintain job performance and request accommodations. So again, you have to know what your rights are. So if you do get a job and you later need accommodation, you need to ask for one. And then you need to show one that's reasonable. It's a high duty, but my office and vocational rehab and the other partners, we're here to help give you information. I can help you give you ideas about what accommodation might be required and what ones are available. So the list doesn't include, this list on rights and responsibility doesn't include every possible duty, but these are the most central ones. So Title I, next slide, please, sir. The Title I is employment provisions in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, the ADA doesn't guarantee you a job, but these are protections against employment discrimination, Title I. And I mentioned about prohibits discrimination against qualified individual with disabilities. But again, the essential functions of the job, you have to be able to do those. But you can have accommodations to help you perform those essential functions. It only covers employers with 15 or more employees. That's just like the other Civil Rights Act, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And again, I mentioned about non-affirmative action. They can still hire the most qualified person for the job. But if two people are equally qualified and one is not selected because of disability, then sometimes there may not be direct proof of disability discrimination, but circumstantial proof. So, and again, the ADA doesn't mandate that employers hire individuals with disabilities, because if it did, you know that our unemployment numbers would go way up. So the next slide, terms, conditions of employment. That's a fancy word for hiring and applications. Again, they cannot ask you questions during the application about your disability. Anything that's likely to obtain information about a disability is prohibited. But the employer should focus on the ability to do the job with or without reasonable accommodation. And a lot of people, can you ask a person in the application process, do you need a reasonable accommodation? The answer is no, because only people with disabilities need reasonable accommodations. So that will likely obtain information about disability. A better way to ask that question, can you perform the essential function of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? In that way, it's shifting the focus from reasonable accommodation on the ability to do the essential functions or major job tasks. So again, employers have a duty to provide accommodation so that individual with disabilities can not only do the job, but also access the privileges of employment. Let's say, for example, an employee break room. Let's say that employee break room and it was down a bunch of stairs and they didn't have an elevator. What if they just said to the employee, well, you can just sit at your desk? Is that an accommodation? No, they could do that anyway. Plus, the part of that employee with disability is missing is the interaction with the other employees in the break room and building bonds. So again, they may have to relocate the break room to another accessible area. So again, employers have to keep disability information confidential. And there are disabilities that you can't tell somebody has a disability. And many disabilities are hidden, and most are. And so it's important to maintain confidentiality because some disabilities may have more of a stigma than others. The next slide, employee obligations. Where a disability is hidden, an employee has duty to disclose disability where there's a need for accommodation. And the question I often get, should I disclose my disability during the interview? Because I don't want the employer not to trust me. And I'm like, if it's one with a stigma, I would probably wait until you're on the job and you need an accommodation to disclose that disability. But it's very Shakespearean. To disclose or not disclose, that is the question. So, but there's a case, Canopco, that you're not really hearing this. You're not really interested in hearing the legal side today. So, but under that case, to get an accommodation, you as an employee with a disability have to identify a specific accommodation and then show that it's reasonable. And that's the law in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. So, all right, moving right along. Let me look at my time. See, do you remember the Gong Show? And, used too much time. They took that, they hit the gong and then they had that big hook, that wooden hook, and they pulled you off. And then Gene, the dance machine came out. You remember that? So, okay, I know I'm old. So there you go. Okay, vocational rehabilitation services. Vocational rehabilitation services has as its central purpose getting jobs for eligible individual disabilities. You heard about eligibility under the community waiver programs. Well, VR has eligibility. Eligible persons are individuals who have physical or mental impairment that is substantial impediment to employment. Not all disabilities would be substantial impediments to employment, but also not only that, that person has to need VR services to enter, maintain, or retain employment. And as Commissioner Jane Elizabeth Bergeron says, VR can help people advance in employment too. So the VR process. So first thing you do is you apply for the job. And how would you apply for a job? You would call VR and ask to set up an appointment with a counselor to apply for services. That counselor would take that information and determine whether or not you're eligible. Then once they found out you're eligible, they would create an individualized plan for employment, an IPE. So if I were dyslexic, I always want to say IEP. I still want to say IEP, and I'm not even dyslexic, but IPE, the individualized plan for employment, lists services VR will provide to help you achieve a vocational goal. And you, in conjunction with the VR counselor, get to determine what the vocational goal is. So closure after 90 days successful employment. So again, they talked about the law. You have Rehabilitation Act. There's a law called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And that merged a lot of the employment programs around the country in each state to work together. So when Jane Elizabeth was talking to Tim from the Alabama Workforce Counselor, that was mandated by that law. So under that law, we don't really have that indicator of 9 days of successful closure, but we keep up with that. The new standard is employment after all the way up to second quarter, and then whether or not you're employed up to the fourth quarter. So, all right. So I know you needed to know that. I knew you were not going to be able to sleep without hearing that, but I have given you a very quick overview of a whole lot of a very complex law, but I tried to boil it down because people with disabilities need to know what their rights are. So in case that they are the match for the job and they are the best qualified person for the job, they can have something to lean against to try to get that job or to be compensated for not getting that job. Because we know jobs are necessary to live the American dream. Those hobbies they mentioned, every one of those costs money, and toys. They say for people, as you get older, you still play with toys. The toys are a lot more expensive. You need a job to get those toys. So does anybody have any questions? See, I promised I got done in like 35 or 40 minutes. So it probably only felt like 5, right? So you're like, I hear that. I always like that. Hear some laughter. It's good. It's moving on a Friday afternoon. So what have you got for me, please?
If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and unmute your computer.
And I will leave this PowerPoint copy as a door prize for whoever wants it, okay? I think I just stunned them, man. They're just amazed, okay? Yeah, yes, sir. Brian Geiger. Yes, sir.
So the question that I'm asking is one that we get asked a lot as an advocacy agency. What is the consumer's next step if they're denied eligibility for VR?
What they can do is they can ask for a reconsideration, or they can ask for informed review. What informed review is, they'll basically bring it to a different set of supervisors. They'll look at it, and the commissioner can be involved. But if all that informed review process doesn't work, then they can ask for an impartial due process hearing. And then, they can even go all the way up to federal court. But I think usually, I know under Commissioner Jane Elizabeth Bergeron, and I'm not just saying this because she's one of my many bosses here, but that she has a culture of yes. If VR should provide that service, we will provide that service. And it also, people have to remember, there is a law, and that law has certain things on it that may prevent us from doing certain things. but we will try to do our best to get anybody employed and provide whatever services are available. So I hope that answers your question, Brian. See, a lawyer trying to get that, narrowed down without putting all the complexities in it. It's a little bit more to that, but that was basically the gist. Thank you for the question, sir. Anybody else? Y'all have been a really good class. I feel like I was, professor, when I was at Auburn, I was, doing teaching graduate and undergraduate classes. We recorded a lot of our sessions, and I recorded a whole bunch in advance. So
I got one question, Graham.
Oh, yes. John Roper. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Here's a good one for you. Now, my daughter's in a wheelchair, and we have a wheelchair accessible van, and that's a stigma. Everybody in a wheelchair has a van. Please tell this audience what your main car is that you drive.
I've got a souped up van,
No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yeah. Well, see, that's part of living the American dream. I have a Dodge Hellcat Challenger. It has base horsepower of 707. I think mine's got 717. Had a few little tweaks on it. It's not the best with gas mileage, but people will get out of your way if they're smart. I'm just kidding. So that's right. So, but again, you can have a job and maybe get the vehicle of your choice or whatever transportation that you would like. So that is an advantage. Thank you for that. But again, I try to beat stereotypes. That's why I always say, what kind of car do you think I drive? And the typical response I get, you drive a van with a lift. So everybody in my family thought I was going to get a van with a lift. So
Chantel, do you have a question for Dr. Sisson?
Hi, I'm Chantel. I really didn't have a question, but I just think you're awesome. I love that you drive a Hellcat. A lot of this stuff I didn't understand about VR, but I am going to look it up. And I took notes the whole time, but I was really impressed with your speech. I just want to say that.
Thank you, Chantel. I appreciate that.
Jess, do you have a question?
Hi, this is me, Jess. I do have a curious question. I actually love reading case law, but my background is doctorate of physical therapy, and I'm in the process of deciding to go back into law for the work I do for advocates as a deaf person. Have you ever seen any case law or court law for a hospital who discriminated a person with a disability, even though they had the qualifications to do the job or not? And how did that look? Because I find healthcare is an interesting niche quite often with case law and ADA sometimes compared to, if you understand what I'm asking.
I understand exactly. That's a great question. And really there's two different angles to that. I haven't seen a case in employment where somebody who is deaf applied for a job at a hospital and they were denied the job because they were deaf. I've seen cases where a hospital would not provide sign language interpreters to deaf persons. There's been a lot of those cases. But there's similar cases, though. I have seen a lot of cases under law. If you want to look at cases, just Google employment discrimination cases under Title I, and it'll pull up a whole bunch. There's a website called findlaw.com. You can get a lot of good case law there. And if you're interested, you can also ask for 11th Circuit case law. That's where most of these employment discrimination cases, because it's only the Court of Appeal cases. I know I'm only saying this because you sound like you're a budding legal eagle there. Those are the only ones that usually get reported. So did I answer your question?
It did. Thank you. I've been assisting people with OCR complaints in other states and encourage them to pursue legal actions. I'm hoping to see a case in our time, but we'll see.
All right, good. And the way to think of litigation is, and this is people wouldn't believe a lawyer would say this, though, litigation is a last resort. You try to get it worked out. But if the effort to get something worked out is futile, sometimes you go directly to a lawsuit. So every situation is going to be different, but usually litigation will be a last resort. Because why would litigation be a last resort? Because if you can get it worked out at arm's length, you get it worked out a lot closer. When you go in litigation, it's going to take longer, but sometimes litigation is necessary.
Shanique, do you have a question for Dr. Sisson? We can't hear you yet. See if you can unmute your desktop.
See, hey, I'm getting some good question. I got some good buzz here.
Yeah,
Good vibe. I'm feeling a really good vibe. You
we
know,
got some hands coming up here.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We hear you now.
Okay, I have a son on the spectrum. Is it an echo?
there's a little
We
bit.
have a slight echo here in the room.
That's
Yes.
okay. Well, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I have a son on the spectrum, and I was wondering, on the application, some of the applications are asking about autism. Do he disclose that, or does he wait? I was confused.
That's a great question. That was the Shakespearean example I gave earlier. To disclose or not disclose, that is a question. A lot of times it's a judgment call. If it's an obvious disability and he doesn't want the stereotype, like with me, it's an obvious disability. I knew they were going to have concerns, so I went ahead and went out and showed them my car because I knew that would alleviate. Once I did that, the stereotypes they had about that. So if you have autism and you're worried that they can see, because some forms of autism are more discernible or more apparent than others. And so if you have a form of autism, if you're on the spectrum and the kind of autism you have, it's obvious that there's an issue there that may impact their ability to do the job. You may want to be proactive, say, I know that you notice these certain qualities or traits I have, but let me show you how I can still do the job. And taking a proactive response like that would be good. So it depends, and that's probably the best answer a lawyer can ever give you is it depends. That's why we have lawyers, because it's not always black and white, but use your best judgment. But if it were me and I had autism and they could tell that there was an issue, I would probably disclose it. But in disclosing it, I would then also disclose how I could do the job, how it would not be a barrier.
Niles, do you have a question for Dr. Sisson?
I do. And yes, my name is Niles Valentine. So I heard some talk about, closing the case after 90 days. Do you think that it should be closed after 90 days? That we should, what's the word that I'm looking for? Not continue to provide services after 90 days, because I do believe that there is a need to not only get them in the door, but also to ensure that they're treated fairly whilst they're employed, that something doesn't decide to change just because, let's say, services discontinued and the employer thinks, oh, they're not looking at us anymore, something like that.
And again, that's a great question. So I think understand the gist of your question is what happens if something happens after 90 days? And again,
Yeah.
the reason the 90 days in there, because that's in the law, it's but there are ways that VR can extend services beyond the 90 days. And one was where somebody wanted to advance. But the other way is there's a program called Retaining a Valued Employee. This is where somebody's in danger of losing their job because of a disability. We have business relation consultants that can meet with the employer. And I know Kathy Lovell is familiar with that program. They can meet with the employer and discuss ways that that person can be accommodated and how they can still do the job. So there are other ways that VR can help. It's not always closed off after the 90 days. So there are some exceptions to that. I can't list all of them here, but again, if you're having issues, it's okay to call your VR counselor up and say, hey, I'm having this. Want to let you know, what do you think I can do? I think if you want to ensure that the answer is no, don't ask the question. Okay. That's what I always say.
Graham, I wanted to give you a follow-up to the previous.
Oh, I love
questioner.
follow-ups. This is good. Okay. This is
Well,
part
she asked-
B1, 2, paren A. Okay.
That's right. She asked, do you disclose if you have autism? Well, we teach our consumers at times, yes, for two reasons.
Mhm.
One is they often have the right to ask for an alternative interview format. So they might not have to do the 50-item objective test to try to get at honesty when they can have a one-on-one communication. And two, because it gives them an opportunity, should it be helpful for them to have a job coach to come with them to the interview. So there are times you might want to disclose it because there are many employers who are sensitive to that, who have diversity knowledge among the recruitment staff, and they'll allow accommodations.
That's beautiful. I need to record that and then add that to my PowerPoint. That is awesome, Brian. Thank you. But again, right now we're in the ultimate job climate because there's 2 jobs for every job applicant. But that, good times don't last forever. And so we think there's a recession coming. But again, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it depends on the severity of the recession. But it doesn't matter what the job market is. Go out there and show how you're unique for a job, how you can bring more to the job than other people. Make the employer want to hire you. And again, I know that's easy said. And somebody told me one time I didn't really have a disability. And I was like, you didn't see me fall out of my chair and hit my head on that stone wall over there one time. But, there's different types of disabilities and there's different challenges. But I think the things I've tried to bring to you today hopefully will help you. And I hope that you learn new things. But I'm still here to ask other questions because it's not quite 3 o'clock yet. So we probably got time for at least one more question.
Maria, do you have a question for Dr. Sisson?
Hello, Dr. Sisson. This is Maria Gutierrez from Auburn. It's not a question. I just want to say thank you so very much for the continuous advocacy that you have been doing for the state and for our families. I've met you 11 years ago, and I'm so honored to have had that opportunity. And thank you again for what you have done for our families.
Thank you, Maria. And I remember her. Thank you for that. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much. All right. Well, you remember Porky Pig? Well, that's all, folks.
We have one more. Jennifer, did you want to say something there?
No, I was just echoing what Maria said. It was a thumbs up that I've met Dr. Sisson as well on several occasions with People First and in our Down syndrome group. And you are such an incredible supporter and spokesperson for all of our community, and you are deeply valued. Thank you.
Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And that concludes his session. So we have a 15-minute break, and we will see you all back here at 3:15. Thank you.